This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. There's been 78 different legislative proposals since 2021 that are aimed at K-12 curriculum. That's according to PEN America. The free speech organization also refers to those proposals as gag order bills. Connecticut is often seen as a safe haven from these kinds of political or ideological attacks in the classroom. But we've seen a rise in debates over curriculum and book ban requests in our state, too. Several organizations here are working on an educator's Bill of Rights. This is a statewide document they hope will help protect the right to teach in accurate and complex ways without censure or punishment. We'll hear from teachers who drafted the document, but first, Connecticut rolled out a Black and Latino history elective this past school year, which is the first of several recent curricular updates and mandates to go live statewide. And joining us now to share their experiences are Daisha Brabham, a social studies teacher at Windsor High School, and Julian Shafer, who's a social studies teacher at Danbury High School. Thank you both for joining us this morning.
Hi.
Morning.
And you can also join the conversation. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. And so, Julian and Daisha, you both piloted this course. And Daisha, we should also start by congratulating you for winning Windsor Teacher of the Year. Congratulations.
Thank you.
It's nice to start the day off with those kind of positive vibes. So can you tell us how you worked with the curriculum that the state offered?
So when I originally piloted the curriculum, I tried to kind of stick traditionally with the curriculum that was put out by the State Education Resource Center. But then by the second year, I started to kind of find a rhythm to be able to try to experiment and try new things that I thought kind of might meet the interests of the students that I was, being able to work with within my classrooms.
And Julian, what about you? How would you compare the course, how you taught it in your first year and your second year?
Pretty similarly to Daisha. My first year, I wanted to try and stick to the state curriculum document as much as possible. The difficulty that I know a lot of teachers found with that was just the amount of really great information in the document. So as history teachers, we often have to figure out what are we going to include, what are we going to leave out. And so by the second year, also after some feedback from students in the first go round, a lot of student feedback mentioned that they wanted to see Black and Latino history kind of intertwined throughout the year rather than, just Black history in the first semester and Latino history in the second. So this past year, my second year teaching this course, I really kind of, switched back and forth and tried to also bring in points of intersection with Black and Latino history. So I'd say that's one of the biggest kind of changes I made in the second year of doing it.
And Daisha, you also found success in combining these two separate semesters, Black and Latino histories. Can you tell us about what that experience was like for you?
I think trying that this year was very, very helpful in just being able to, as Julian kind of pointed out, being able to draw those comparisons, but also make room for students who don't exist at kind of that binary. I had some students who identified as Afro-Latino who really wanted their voices and their experiences to be heard and affirmed in the classroom. And so I found a lot of strength in that, in addition to really pointing to those connections and those areas of cross solidarity. I think one of my favorite units this year was the activism unit, in which students were able to kind of look at the collaborations of the Black Panthers and the Young Lords, and being able to kind of talk about those organizations and how they were able to find strength and commonality with one another, but also kind of use that to propel themselves towards social justice. And so I think that was a very helpful framing.
And I know this is something that we certainly can talk for days, and I definitely want to dig in deeper in terms of, you finding that connection as a teacher with your students. But I also want to ask Julian, too, because you both have found a lot of success in combining the two different histories. But Julian, you also were able to sort of we wove together Puerto Rican history into one unit as well. So can you talk about that process? Was it similar to the Black and Latino units, or is it a completely different experience for you?
I think a lot of what I covered in the class this year was similar to what I'd done the previous year. But then for example, my unit on Puerto Rico, in the original curriculum document, there are a lot of, points about Puerto Rican history, but they're kind of scattered throughout different units. And so I thought it would be more helpful because Puerto Rico, does have a unique history, really as the oldest colony in the world between, colonization under Spain and then really the United States. And so kind of putting that into one big unit where students could see kind of the continuity of the history, how this, colonial or colonization status or colony status is really still like impacting Puerto Rico today. And so I think by, bringing together all these different points of Puerto Rican history and putting them into one unit, I think my students ended up getting a much better understanding of the historical and then current issues that Puerto Rico faces and Puerto Ricans face, and the struggle for justice that they've been engaged in.
And this is, of course, a familiar space for you. You also previously taught an elective on race and ethnicity. So I'm curious to hear, what did this class compare to other history classes that you've taught, and how did it inspire the Black and Latino Studies course?
Yeah, so around the same time that students around the state were, asking the state legislature for a course on the history of race and racism, and that really ended up becoming this Black and Latino Studies course. Students in Danbury High School were asking for the same thing, but really at, our school level. So working with a few student organizations and other teachers, there was the Black Lives Matter Club and Latino Club and other groups. We had petitioned for and got, with the support from administration, to give them credit, a race and ethnicity studies course. And this was 3 years before the Black and Latino history course became, a course. And so for that, I would say the biggest difference I've noticed was that the makeup of that class was very diverse. In Danbury High School, we, do have students from a large number of racial and ethnic backgrounds. And so, I think that course was more of a general history of race and racism in the United States, versus the Black and Latino Studies course is more Black and Latino history. And of course, these conversations of the history of race and racism are, a part of that. But one, it's a different class. This class has become more of, I think, an affinity group for Black and Latino students in the school, which I think has its own value and importance. But I would definitely say I've noticed who is taking the class is different. And it does feel like we've got a strong sense of community in this class, too, the new Black and Latino Studies class. That wasn't quite there in the same way before. So that's, they're different in their own good ways.
And Daisha, this is also your wheelhouse as well. You've adapted this course to your classroom. And with what Julian was just saying, in terms of, the makeup of the classroom is different for, literally every classroom. What's your response to what he just said? Certain courses becoming kind of like an affinity group for certain students.
I definitely would agree. I think that this course, in part because of the curriculum that's being taught and the approach to this course, I do think that this course naturally kind of leans itself into creating that type of atmosphere for students to explore and discuss their identities, their experiences, their backgrounds, and think about how that applies to the past and present and future. But I do think that has been a concern of teachers that I've spoken to, of just making sure that we are doing intentional recruitment of students from all backgrounds to see the value in being able to take a course like this, because it is valuable for all students to be able to have access to a course that discusses this history. And in addition to those larger themes that Julian is pointing to, race, ethnicity, et cetera.
And this is something that is valuable for both teachers and students. So how do you think about this course as meeting a need for students?
I think the course fits a need for students in that it provides, I think this course provides, as most history courses should, I think this course provides a really good framework for how all history teachers, history classes should really be taught, and that it really not only leans into the past, but also really focuses on highlighting real relevant connections to the present. And so students are able to draw connections between the themes of what they're learning in the class and what they're experiencing on the day-to-day. And so I think, again, that's why this course is so beneficial for all students. In addition to them being able to understand parts of history that oftentimes are not reflected in the US history or the civics or the modern global curriculums that, sometimes are taught through across the state.
And so I feel like what I'm getting out from what both you and Julian have been saying is there is an interconnectedness in terms of how history is being taught. It feels like it's very difficult to separate one topic to the other because it's so connected. And with Daisha, you have a master's in public history. You've also helped with the state's recent development of indigenous curriculum. So, from your experience with both in the classroom and outside of it, what opportunities do you see for addressing Black and Latino history or indigenous history or AAPI history sort of within the bounds of a U.S. history course, for example?
Yeah, I think that there is an approach in which you can kind of discuss each of those areas. I think that there's an approach that can kind of silo those stories off, right? Where there's an African American history, there's a Puerto Rican history, there's an LGBTQIA history. And I think that makes sense. And you see this also even in historiography. You see this in public history sites, right? That there is this kind of separate story. But in reality, all these stories are really converging together, in the same way that I would say that you can't really talk about African American history without talking about Asian American history, right? Like there's so many different intersections and different connections that existed throughout the past, So I think that the best way moving forward is for us to find ways to make sure that this becomes just a study of the past as opposed to just individual groups of people. The connection I always make is hip hop, right? My dad grew up in New York. And one thing he always highlighted to me is that it wasn't necessarily just an African American thing. Like Puerto Rican people had influences in it. Jamaicans were kind of like the first people to kind of bring the hip hop scene to New York. And so those cross-cultural, cross-racial style, cross-cultural products are important explorations for students because they can kind of find themselves, but also find each other in the class as well. So I think that is what I would think we should start moving more towards, as opposed to just necessarily focusing on making sure that each group is kind of represented, but more how are we discussing the past from an inclusive lens.
Well, I really love that hip hop connection because music, I feel like, is another language of interconnectedness and talk about history. That's a whole different series of shows that you're having us do here, Daisha. And Julian, I would love your thoughts too, talking about the complications of potentially siloing these as separate topics. But obviously from this conversation, we're seeing that they're all so connected. And we know you taught the Black and Latino Studies elective while teaching a U.S. history course during the same year. So what are your thoughts about that, Julian?
Right. So I really do try and go into teaching U.S. history often with an intention to discuss, things like race, class, and gender throughout the year. And so if we take my unit on World War II in the United States, I start by asking the question, was World War II an era of opportunity? Because the often dominant narrative is that, our economy was booming at the home front. So there's, many narratives around this idea of it bringing us out of the Great Depression. But then we, really look at a diverse, set of people's experiences during the war. And so when we start to talk about, Mexican migrant workers coming to the United States through the Bracero program, it was really in ways an exploitation of and an opportunity for Mexican migrant workers. We look at Japanese American incarceration and the experiences of women in the economy. And so really trying to complicate, students' understanding of this narrative of, opportunity during the war. And we do that by looking at different people's experiences. And so I think you can really do that for most topics in U.S. history. It's just, again, we need to make those conscious decisions of whose stories do we include. And unfortunately, some things are going to get left out, but we need to be, aware of those decisions that we're making.
You've been listening to social studies teacher Daisha, Brabham, and Julian Shafer, and their students will be joining the conversation after a quick break. And a reminder for our listeners that you too can join the conversation. Leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. We've been talking about a Black and Latino history elective class that was rolled out here in Connecticut over the last school year. And 2 high school social studies teachers just shared with us their experiences on teaching the class. And now let's hear from 2 students who took the course this year. Joining me now is Damela Seal. She's a Windsor High School student, as well as Sarai Pichardo, a student at Danbury High School. Thank you both for joining us this morning.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi.
And still with us are their teachers, Daisha Brabham from Windsor High School and Julian Shafer from Danbury High School. So, Sarai, I want to start with you. You were in Mr. Shafer's 2 classes this year, Black and Latino History and U.S. History. Can you talk to us about your experience with this elective and what made that experience unique?
I absolutely adored this class because it was very eye-opening, educational, and engaging. I mean, there wasn't a single unit where I was bored or uninterested because there was so much that we were learning that we kind of were deprived from in other social studies classes prior to this. But it was very cohesive in the way that the curriculum flowed throughout the year, like the way that we mixed both Latin and Latino and Black history. It was just like eye-opening. I learned a lot more than I thought I would. But yeah, it was definitely very engaging through and through from the beginning to the end.
Well, I think it's the highest compliment you can give a teacher by describing their course as not being bored. And Damela, what about you? Did you have a favorite part of the course? What was your experience like?
Okay, going to this course, I was I had to keep an open mind about what I was going to learn. And going in the beginning of the year, we started learning about like the different racial identities of like the Latino community, if they wanted to be called like Latino, Latin E, Latinx. And this class was very fun, and it was a very good learning opportunity to learn new history outside of like the American history of presidency and other things.
And Damela, you also shared with us a very specific Christopher Columbus related project that you really enjoyed. Can you walk us through what that exercise was like? How did that work and why did you like it?
Okay, so the Christopher Columbus, we did a trial and we had 4 groups of students and each group had a role in the trial. So we had the Columbus as one group, Columbus men as the other. Then we had the king and the queen, and then we had the system. And as a whole, we had to figure out who was most guilty. But as we were going through and figuring it out, we were all like blaming each other because it wasn't one person's fault. And I really enjoyed this because it shows you how one system of a country is like so like messed up that it creates so many problems for their citizen, and it's just all about who's like correctly to blame, because you can't really blame a system because it was created by someone. So that's what I really got from like the trial, and it was a really fun trial too.
And I don't know if I've ever heard someone describe a trial as being fun to be a part of. What role did you play? And was there something that really surprised you, Damela?
I played the system, so everyone was blaming the system, but I had to defend that because it's like someone created the system. It's not a person, and you have to find a way to blame someone. And what I found out from this is that most students, like, they thought, oh, the system was created, so you have to blame that person. But you have to think about like who created the system and who's higher up and what they were thinking of doing at that time. So that's where the king and the queen came in and how they were the one who funded Christopher Columbus. They're the one who created the system. So yeah.
And Sarai, you did this exercise as well. What was your experience like?
It made me realize how complex. I mean, the trial in itself was very difficult. Like Damela said, there's so much that went into it, and then you can't really just blame one group of people or one system because, like you said, there's people behind it. And I actually just found the paper from when we did this, so I believe I was the Taino people when I was doing this. So it was kind of hard to blame the Taino people, obviously, because they were, the victims in all of this. But it's very complex. That was one of the main things that I realized throughout this class, that there's so many things that go into our history. And the main thing that I could just think about while I was doing this trial was how complex it was. And it was so thought-provoking because we were all just sitting there basically arguing with each other, trying to figure out who's more to blame. But we all know that there's so much to it. There's so much behind everything that you can't just blame one group of people. But it's very complex, and that's what I got from this entire thing, was how complex it was. And it was a little fun. It was very frustrating, but definitely a little fun.
Love adding a little frustration
Yeah.
with fun. Daisha, I want to bring you into this conversation real quick and talk about why is this such a powerful exercise. I mean, we're here from both Damela and Sarai, who said it was thought-provoking. It was a lot of blaming, and it was also very complicated. Daisha, can you talk a little bit about the concept of complicity here?
Yeah, I think this is actually, as was mentioned, me and Julian ended up teaching this lesson. This comes from the Zen Education Project, which I definitely recommend for any teachers out there for trying to find curricular resources that help to highlight those kind of bigger themes of accountability, complicity, and really try to get students to start questioning their own thought process and how they approach the past. I think this was an awesome exercise in that, as Damela and Sarai are both kind of pointing out, it is kind of our gut reaction to just like, who's to blame, who's the most accountable, but then trying to get students to kind of think about what does complicity look like in times in which injustice occurs, especially with things when you're thinking about like genocide of Taino people. I'll say that what I took the most out of this lesson is how important it is for students to engage in this and how it prepares them for looking at the present. Around the same time that we were engaging in this activity was the same time that the murder of Tyre Nichols had happened. And I was kind of grappling with my response of what I was feeling internally as a Black woman living in America. And this assignment kind of provided a space for me to talk with my students about, who do we blame in this situation? Is it the police? Is it the system of racism? Is it the system of police brutality? Is it us, the taxpayers, right? Like the people who fund this system, and just being able to have that opportunity to really grapple and see my students grapple with those questions and to kind of come to their own ideas about what they want to see in the world was just a very powerful experience, and probably one of the most powerful experiences of my entire teaching career.
And that is a powerful thing to experience, I think, even just as a listener right now, learning about this experience. And Julian, I also would love to hear your thoughts on this, because you often did trials in your class. And with what Daisha is talking about, being able to have students engage and grapple with the so many questions that we have just by this 5 minutes of conversation. Can you talk about the importance of being able to give students this kind of exercise to really sort of play the role and, I guess, kind of witness history as they are creating history?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think Sarai, I'm very pleased to say, really captured what I hope my students were going to be taking away from this lesson, which was not who is the person or the people most to blame, but rather the complexity of, systematic violence and and I think from there that kind of gives students, I hope that gives students a critical lens for when we're looking at issues today. Daisha had mentioned police brutality, and then really just the system of mass incarceration that's a part of, and talking about complicity today. What are the forces or the interests or the people that are perpetuating oppressive systems that are causing violence, and is it necessarily like individual blame that's going to help us figure out how to dismantle these systems, or do we need to kind of like step back and take a look at how maybe different interests are, again, perpetuating injustices or something? This topic of culpability also makes me think of, when we talk about enslavement in the United States, again, who is complicit in that? And so you have, of course, enslavers themselves, but then what about the blacksmiths in Connecticut, right, that were forging chains and making a living off of that? And so I think this idea is really applicable across time and across issues. And so that like idea of complexity and complicity, I definitely think are the key takeaways here. And I think it sounds like the lesson did a good job with that.
And Julian, with what you just said too, think about how you sort of create a connection between the past and the present. Can you give us a preview of the lesson that you taught on the prison industrial complex? Because you localized this lesson a little.
Yeah, so I really ended up creating a unit out of it, and there were several different pieces to it, and parts of it were local. So one of the local aspects was looking at the Pentagon's 1033 program, where they give surplus military equipment to local police departments. And so we looked at, in Connecticut, what kind of equipment have our police departments been getting? In Bridgeport, we have a mine-resistant, practically a tank, which is, I live in Bridgeport. In Danbury, I know there are many M16 rifles that the military has given their local police department. And so I kind of created a city council simulation where students were the city councilors, and they were being asked, essentially, should the city council of Danbury accept this like free, I'm putting air quotes around it, this free military equipment for our police department. And so we really, we got into a discussion after looking at how this equipment was used in Ferguson after the wake of the murder of Mike Brown. What is the actual impact of this equipment in local police departments of militarized policing? And so my students ended up, in their role as city councilors, declining the equipment from the 1033 program. So that was part of this unit on the prison industrial complex. We also, looked at the history of policing over time. And so we looked at the relationship of police violence in, what were called race riots in like the 1920s. And then the, connection of police and, racial violence in the 2000s. And so really by looking at this relationship of policing and racial violence, mass racial violence across time, I think that gave students this, kind of broad perspective to apply to the things happening around us. And so those were a few of the things that we looked at.
And Sarai, how did this class differ from other history classes that you may have taken? Can you tell us real quickly about that experience?
It was, the way it was taught, it was kind of more like, I don't want to say student driven, but there was so many times where Mr. Shafer would just let us like sit there and talk about whatever the topic was and just try to understand it, put things into perspective. But it was also so like the way it was formatted was made so that we could make those connections to modern times. So we would look back at, history and things that went down and connect it to how it still affects us today, and so how it still affects our government today and our the systems. And I saw that a lot in the prison industrial complex unit because we got to connect so many things from the past to the present and how these things are, how certain systems are inherently racist and things like that. It just went into that in so much more detail. And it was so different from other history classes that I've taken. And even though I'm a little biased because I did really enjoy my U.S. history class this year, but that was definitely because Mr. Shafer was teaching it. It definitely had a lot to do with the way we could connect the history across Latin America and U.S., as well as connecting it to modern times. That definitely spoke to me. But it was just so driven and like thought-provoking for all students. And I feel like most people could agree with me on that.
Well, that's like the best kind of bias to have, right? I want to ask Damela as well that you helped with a student-led teaching for teachers all about teaching race and ethnicity. What was that like for you?
It was very interesting to see like a different point of view of students teaching teachers, because standing there and creating creating a presentation for teachers to be engaged with, and having like creating scenarios to describe to teachers what goes on in the school community that they don't see but students face every day. So this was a very good learning opportunity for me, but also for teachers to see what they could do to better their like classroom or just the class community.
And Daisha, we got a minute or two left here, and I want to ask, though, we know Windsor students pushed to offer the course to ninth graders as well. Can you tell us about how you participate in that, and why was that so important?
I think it's really important just because I think as been highlighted, this course is so powerful, and I think that we should be trying to expand this to as many students as possible. In part because of what it represents. It also was a really, personally, it was a really awesome experience for me just because to see how by the end of the class, at the end of the year, all students were kind of like pushing for this class to be expanded, writing to making kind of statements to our local boards of education to be able to see the course be expanded was just a really inspiring thing for myself. But I was really just I'm excited that the course is going to be now offered to ninth graders as an option to take. And I'm also just really excited that we'll continue to see the course evolve as time goes on to hopefully be useful, relevant, and inspiring to students to take what they've learned and then apply it on. In our when Damela was a part of that student-led teaching, it was after we had spent almost a month of talking about activism. And so taking her experiences and then charging her up to feel like, hey, I can inform, I can be an active member of my school community by advocating for this course to be expanded, or I can advocate with my teachers or share resources on my experiences. I think that's what hopefully the goal of all of our history classes are.
You've been listening to Damela Seal and Sarai Pichardo. Thank you both so much for your time. And their social studies teacher, Daisha, Brabham, and Julian Shafer will be staying with us to discuss an educator's Bill of Rights in Connecticut. You can also join the conversation. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. An educator's Bill of Rights was developed by many teachers unions here in Connecticut as well as other organizations. The document calls for learning spaces for students and working spaces for educators that are free from harassment and intimidation. And it underscores the need to teach in accurate and complex ways without censure or punishment. And here to discuss an educator's Bill of Rights they developed is Daisha Brabham. She's a social studies teacher at Windsor High School, as well as Julian Shafer, who's a social studies teacher at Danbury High School. So Daisha, I want to jump straight to it. Can you take us back to the beginning? When did the idea for an educator's Bill of Rights come about?
So the Educator Bill of Rights really came out when we began its development about 2 years ago, and just kind of placing back to that time, as was mentioned kind of in the intro, I think there's an understanding or an idea that Connecticut has largely been kind of removed from these national discussions on teaching race in the classroom that we see emerging in places like Texas and Florida. But there were some grumblings and some kind of, as you mentioned, kind of moves for book bans, trying to kind of like influence Board of Educations to change curriculum or limit topics on race and racism in the classroom. And so the Connecticut Educators Association, the AFT, the Connecticut Association of Public School Superintendents, and the Anti-Racist Teaching and Learning Collective came together to draft a document that will hopefully be informative for boards of education to think of ways in which we need to protect teachers, but also with the underlying message that the environment that you create for teachers has a direct tie on students. And so, although it's kind of framed as an educator bill of rights, I think in many ways it is a student bill of rights, and that students are deserve to have access to this type of education. They've proven time and time again that this is what they want to see happening in the classroom. And so it's the role of school districts, it's the role of educators to provide an environment for that learning to occur.
And Julian, you were also involved in drafting this document. What were some of the essential and important pieces that you found?
Yeah, so there were a couple, especially that were reasons why I wanted to be a part of this, and for sure, being a teacher of the African American and Latino Studies history course, and then before that, the Race and Ethnicity Studies course. I have, of course, seen the backlash against, teaching about race and racism in schools, among, other kind of backlashes. And for, living in Connecticut, again, I think they should mention that we often think that we're kind of insulated from these backlashes, but it's, one, not necessarily the case. And then two, still important to be proactive about, making sure that we protect any gains that we've made and being, forward thinking about teaching about racism, gender, sexuality, and all of those things in our classrooms. And so for me, just this kind of like central concept of being able to, teach with the truth and teach to these topics was a reason why I supported this Educators Bill of Rights. And agree with Daisha wholeheartedly that, an Educator's Bill of Rights is going to be benefiting everyone in our schools and really mostly the students. If we are not able to teach with the truth, then these engaging classes and lessons that, we've been putting together for our students may not be hitting as hard if we feel this chilling effect that, I need to avoid topics about race because I feel like there might be a backlash against me and I might, lose my job. And so I think, again, being proactive about that is important. Also in my district, I'd mentioned I used to teach before Black and Latino Studies, Race and Ethnicity Studies class. And I do know, I'm not exactly sure of the level of complaints against the course, but complaints did happen. And so eventually, and I think there were a couple factors that went into it, all that really relate back to this Bill of Rights. But when the Black and Latino Studies course came out, the decision was made to cut the Race and Ethnicity Studies course. I wouldn't be surprised if part of that had to do with, kind of being able to cover, saying, this Black and Latino Studies course is a statewide course, and therefore, like the school, you can't really blame the school for it. It's possible. Also, though, to give credit to my admins, they were, happy to have a race and ethnicity studies course. And so for us too, it may have just been, a lack of resources in our school district. We can't offer this many electives because we don't have enough money for enough teachers. And that goes back to equitable resources, which is another part of this Educators Bill of Rights, that all schools, regardless of zip code, should be able to have, opportunities for their students and their staff. And so really, this is about creating quality education across the state for our students. And, teachers, we want what's best for our kids. And so I think this Bill of Rights helps us, can hopefully help us achieve that.
And Daisha, would love for you to respond real quickly to what Julian just said. Do you echo a lot of his sentiments and what has happened in the district?
For sure. And I think, when we think about educator bill of rights, I think people's gut reaction is kind of like, this is a document that's supposed to protect teachers. Like, in many ways, I think when people might hear that, they might think, oh, this is a document trying to protect teachers from students or protects teachers from stakeholders, parents, right? But in reality, it's not just that. It's about what vision do we have for our schools? And what role do educators play in that? And how can we as districts or we as stakeholders, because we're all stakeholders in education, it's a collective good that we are investing in when we're investing in our youth. How can we create the best environments for them? We've talked about this with the Anti-Racist Teaching and Learning Collective. Like, no, we don't necessarily have book bans or widespread book bans in Connecticut. But if our schools don't have librarians, right, because they don't have funding, then in reality, we're creating that same detrimental impact, and that students are not having access to this information. They're not having access to education that fits their needs. And so this is the reason why an educator bill of rights or having that language is important for our districts. And I think that's important for the community to know, is that in reality, education is a collective effort. We're all kind of pouring into these systems. And so we need to make sure that our investments are being protected, and that we'll all see the benefits of that as these students progress.
And joining us now by phone is State Representative Christine Palm. Representative Palm, welcome to the show.
Good morning. Glad to be here.
And you have forwarded an unrelated Teachers' Bill of Rights this session, actually, and we only have a couple of minutes, but can you tell us real quickly about it?
Yes, it is actually related. Not only do I agree with everything your learned guests have said, but I would like to see it put into state statute. I would like to put the force of law behind what they are doing, because unfortunately there are hate groups, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center here in Connecticut, that go under the guise of parent rights groups, and they are really, in their foundation, racist, sexist, misogynist, climate deniers. And I think that unless we have the force of law behind statute that says you may not harass a teacher for teaching what is pedagogically sound and important, then people will continue to get away with it. So I'd love to work with your guests and make their ideas into a bill that I'm already working on for next year, because I think we really need to have it be in our statute.
And can you really quickly tell us about the bill that you introduced?
Yes, it was essentially what they've said. It said you cannot ban books that are pedagogically sound. You cannot harass a teacher for teaching what that teacher is trained to do, and that includes slavery as part of U.S. history. That includes the man-made nature of climate chaos. It includes the history of LGBTQ studies, all these Latino history, the things that we have put into statute over the years as electives. I personally think they should be mandatory, because my fear is that we're going to end up preaching to the choir. That the kids who are gay are going to take the history of the LGBTQ movement. Kids of color are going to gravitate toward that.
I want to thank you so much, Representative Palm, for taking the time.
It's important for white kids to learn that history, especially. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Representative Palm. And we only have a couple of minutes left, Daisha, but I would love to get your response to what Representative Palm has to say. And what is your perspective on her experience?
Yeah, I would echo everything that she's saying. I think, again, if we're thinking about like students kind of being siloed off, right? We're all on all these different education tracks, as opposed to, this is really as I keep saying, it's a collective effort. School is collective, it's collaborative. And so we need to work together to be able to, again, create the environments that I want for Damela and Sarai to continue to have in their school systems, and that I want all students to have access to. And I think, again, we're framing it again. It's an educator bill of rights that is trying to make sure that we're protecting student experiences. So that's what I would say back to that. And I think, again, the more we work together, the more we'll be able to see more of this change, or continue to see more of this change across Connecticut.
And Julian would also love your response to what Representative Palm has to say. And what are your thoughts about the bill itself?
Absolutely. I think this Bill of Rights is necessary. I think, considering the fact that we are living in, this kind of backlash against teaching about things like race, class, gender, sexuality, we need to make sure teachers are protected. And then, a Bill of Rights from the state, I think, would also kind of have the reverse effect of this chilling effect that this backlash might be having, right? So if the state is kind of coming out and saying, teachers, you have like the the backing of law of the state to go ahead and teach the truth, teach these subjects, to the with justice, essentially, then I think teachers will be much more feel much more supported to be able to do these kinds of things. And I think our students deserve that.
And Daisha, we got about a minute left, but in lieu of Representative Palm's legislation, where does the Educators' Bill of Rights that you developed stand? Do you have a status for us?
Yes, we're really excited. The document is going to be readily available this fall. We're hoping on kind of developing a kind of proper rollout of kind of this document, but also having students kind of share their experiences. I think what we've kind of echoed throughout this time is just that, oftentimes these efforts are often kind of seen as ways to protect students, but I think that what's been shown in on the students, from the students' perspective, me and Julian's perspective, is that what we're really just asking to do is to provide students a place to really process the world that they live in. And so if you're not allowing all students that we all live in, and so if we're not protecting or providing an environment for that, then in reality, we're failing students. And it really is nothing short of educational malpractice. And so that's what I would say. And I'm really excited to see more efforts like this evolve across the state.
And you've been listening to social studies teachers Daisha Brabham and Julian Shafer. Thank you both so much for joining us this morning and helping us understand the courses better.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Katie Pellico. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you so much for listening.